Major Ron Keller had flown combat sorties before, but nothing prepared him for what unfolded above the arid mountains of northern Syria, where dust storms blurred friend from foe, and the skies churned with echoes of distant fire he was piloting. An A-10 Thunderbolt nicknamed the Warthog for its rugged design and near invincibility, and as the sun dipped low, casting long orange shadows across jagged ridgelines, he had the uneasy sense that something was off. Something unspoken was coiling, in the air just outside the canopy. He scanned the terrain below, watching for enemy movement along the dry riverbeds and forgotten roads, where insurgents often hid in plain sight, blending into the earth itself like ghosts, waiting for a reason to rise. He was on a standard patrol checking the perimeter after a convoy reported hostile movement near Sector Delta 4, and while his radar showed nothing, the gut feeling that had kept him alive for 12 years in the service was screaming louder than any onboard warning ever could. Then it happened: a flash from the ground, a scream from the missile alert system, and a sharp metallic crack that ran up through the belly of the aircraft like a tuning fork being struck. Keller instinctively yanked, the stick banking hard right as the A-10 groaned under stress, his training kicking in like muscle memory. As the first explosion bloomed behind him, a puff of smoke that faded fast in the high wind, but left behind a deep, unsettling vibration that danced through the fuselage. He cursed under his breath and called out to base reporting a confirmed missile strike, requesting permission to disengage and return to base for inspection. But before the controller could respond, a second impact rocked. The aircraft this time hitting closer to the wing root, sending the bird into a wobbling lurch that Keller barely corrected in time. Alarms erupted all at once, red lights blinking across the HUD. The hydraulic pressure dropped by half, and the yaw. Controls started to stiffen. Keller gritted his teeth and looked around, expecting to see the fiery remnants of his own wing falling away from the sky. But the wing held barely, and as he leveled out the jet, he saw something that made him forget every protocol, every rule of engagement, and every ounce of logic drilled into him during thousands of hours in simulators and real combat ahead of him. No more than 2 clicks out, flying at a strange angle, was another A-10 Thunderbolt flying low with smoke pouring from its tail and clearly missing almost half of its right wing. That was not possible. Not in the airframe. He knew not in a bird that needed both wings to manage the sort of balance that kept it from spiraling into the dirt below. And yet there it was, flying level, or something close to it, climbing slowly as though nothing were wrong, and Keller felt an icy crawl up his spine because no one else was supposed to be in this sector, and the last reported A-10 in this area had been rotated back to base 4 hours ago with no replacements listed. He tried to raise the other pilot on comms, toggling between encrypted and open channels, but only static greeted him. The kind of static that sounded wrong, like it had a voice. Buried deep inside, like someone whispering beneath layers of noise, his training told him to pull away, report the sighting, and return to base before his own systems failed completely. But something primal locked his eyes on the ghost ship in front, of him refusing to let go. The other aircraft banked left too hard for the condition it was in. Keller saw sparks fly off the damaged wing stub as the jet dipped lower, gliding through the canyon like a shadow stretched across stone. He pushed his throttle forward, fighting the vibration rattling his seat, and closed the distance, hoping to get a better visual, maybe a tail number, maybe a glimpse of the pilot, maybe something that made sense in a world where this kind of thing should not exist. Kept his camera running, recording everything, hoping someone else would see this later and tell him he was not losing his mind, that he was not hallucinating after taking 2 hits and running on fumes and adrenaline. But as he approached the strange aircraft, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The cockpit was shattered, the canopy gone, the glass blown outward as if something had escaped, not entered, and the seat was empty, not ejected, not removed. Just gone like the pilot, had never been there, or had left the jet mid-flight without a trace. Keller felt a strange pressure in his ears, like he was flying through a different kind of air, something thick and electric. The sky above dimmed slightly, though it was still hours before sunset, and the ground below took on a bluish tint, like he had crossed into a part of the world not yet mapped. Still, he followed, unable to stop, drawn in by the impossibility of the moment, until the damaged A-10 made a sudden sharp descent toward a narrow gorge that looked too tight to navigate even for a craft in perfect condition. Keller hesitated for a breath, then angled in behind the mystery jet, fully expecting to see it crash or vanish into the cliffside. But what happened next did not make sense, because it did not crash. It did not spiral. It simply vanished below the ridgeline. He banked hard, right climbing to get a better view, but the canyon was empty. No smoke, no wreckage, no heat signature on infrared. Just wind dust and silence that rang louder than any explosion ever could. Keller circled once, twice, 3 times. But there was nothing left. No trace that the aircraft had ever existed, and his own bird was now screaming for attention, systems failing one after another, and fuel dropping fast. He turned back toward base, running on emergency power and instinct, fighting every pull of gravity and mechanical drag, until the runway came into view like a lifeline stretched across desert sand. Ground control was yelling in his ear, asking for status, and he gave them what he could, but his voice was flat cold, as if he had left part of himself back there in the sky with the thing that should not have flown. The landing was rough metal scraped concrete, and smoke poured from the undercarriage as Keller brought the wounded bird to a stop. Fire crews raced in, foam spraying, and medics swarmed, but he waved them off, eyes still locked on the horizon, as if expecting that broken A-10 to reappear any second. Rising from behind the hills like a ghost, refusing to stay buried. When the base commander asked for a report, Keller said only what he saw and handed over the footage. But already he knew what the answer would be. No other craft in the air, no radar. Confirmation, no other pilot, missing nothing but him and his own damaged aircraft, struck by 2 missiles and limping home. And yet he had seen it. He had followed it. He had nearly touched it. And as the sun finally set over the airfield, painting the clouds in blood and shadow, Keller stood alone beside the steaming wreck of his A-10, wondering how something with half a wing could fly, and why it felt like it had been waiting for him out there above the mountains, waiting for someone who had already been marked by fire and steel and silence. He pulled into a defensive climb, black smoke trailing behind as alarms screamed from the cockpit, telling him systems were failing one by one. The left aileron, the hydraulic pressure, the fuel balance, all skewed and deteriorating rapidly. Each movement of the control stick met with resistance that grew heavier by the second. The A-10, known for its resilience, was fighting to stay in the sky, and Keller knew from instinct alone that he had limited time before the aircraft gave up completely. But what he saw next made no sense, even in his adrenaline-soaked mind. Another A-10 flying oddly across the valley, nose up, tail drooping, and astonishingly missing nearly half of its right wing. Keller blinked hard once, twice, thinking maybe he was seeing a mirage brought on by concussion or stress, but the shape remained, and the impossible aircraft continued on its path, rising slightly, banking slightly, defying all known rules of physics and aerodynamics. Keller had flown hundreds of hours in the A-10. He had trained in every emergency simulator possible, but nothing could have prepared him for this. Nothing could explain how a bird with that kind of damage could still be airborne, let alone flying, as if guided by something beyond human hands. He toggled his radio, trying to reach the pilot. Toggled again. Switched frequencies from secure to open to emergency channels, but only static poured through his headset. And this static sounded wrong, not just noise, but layered, like someone or something was speaking beneath it. Words buried under white hiss. Keller turned the volume down, the sound triggering something deep in his chest, a chill that spread through his ribs and settled behind his eyes, the kind of chill you feel when you know you are being watched but cannot see from where. The other A-10 was pulling away slowly, like it had somewhere specific to be, and Keller realized he was following now, not by command, not by duty, but by something else, some deep current dragging him forward. And even though his own jet was trailing smoke and leaking pressure and every warning system was blinking in red and amber, he could not turn back. Not yet. He needed to see it up close. Needed to understand if this was some rogue pilot, a test aircraft, some drone experiment kept off the books, or if this was something else entirely, something that should not exist in the world. He knew. The A-10 ahead dipped its nose and descended into a narrow pass between two ridges, and Keller followed, hesitant at first, then with purpose. The terrain below jagged with rock and old ruins, the kind of place where time seemed to sleep and air grew heavier with every foot he lost in altitude. The valley narrowed until the light itself seemed to dim, and the only thing ahead of him was that impossible aircraft flying like a shadow stitched to the horizon, and he began to notice something else. There were no birds in the sky, no movement on the ground, no heat plumes or signs of life. His infrared sweep came back blank, and even the wind had dropped out, replaced by a dead silence that wrapped around the cockpit like a vacuum. Keller was sweating now despite the cool air flowing through the flight suit, and every muscle in his body was tight as if preparing for something not yet named. His breath fogged faintly on the canopy, even though it should not have, and the instruments began to jitter slightly, needles bouncing like they were unsure of themselves or of where they were in space. The other A-10 dropped lower, hugging the canyon floor, and Keller followed, even as his controls stiffened more, the hydraulics groaning with effort. His bird was barely holding together, but he could not turn away. Not now, not when he was this close. He brought up the camera feed and zoomed in, hoping to catch a tail number or some mark of origin, but the image blurred at every frame, like the jet was resisting being seen, resisting being captured or remembered, and then for one fraction of a second, the image cleared just long enough for him to see the tail number, or what he thought was the tail number, because it was familiar, too familiar. Blinked again, heart-hammering, and looked with his own eyes, but the other A-10 was already pulling away faster now, as if it had finished letting him see and was done. Keller shoved his throttle forward despite the protests of his aircraft pushing, into the narrowest part of the canyon, where walls rose steep on either side, and shadows swallowed the light, and as he crossed a point marked by two jagged stones that looked unnaturally symmetrical, his radio cut out completely, all channels gone, just silence and the faint whisper of static that no longer sounded like noise but words. The cockpit lights dimmed, not all at once but in a soft ripple, like a breath being held, and Keller felt his skin crawl because now the air itself felt wrong. Heavier, thicker, charged with something invisible, like he had passed through a wall without knowing, and come out into a version of the world not entirely his own. He could still see the A-10 ahead climbing now, rising sharply toward a shelf of rock that should have forced a turn, but instead the jet pulled straight up into a small pocket of cloud and disappeared completely. Keller reached the same point seconds later, pulling hard on the stick, expecting to see the aircraft rising into the sun. But there was nothing, just sky and cliffs, and below him the deep valley winding endlessly, without sign of the other craft. He circled once, twice, 3 times, and still saw no trace, no shadow, no smoke, no glint of metal, just empty air, and slowly he became aware that something was very wrong with his own jet. Now something deeper than mechanical failure, something that made him feel as if he had stayed too long in a place that did not want him there. The camera feed had frozen the altimeter, flickered between values, and the artificial horizon spun slowly, as if trying to orient to a reality that no longer matched its internal compass. His hands felt numb. His thoughts started to slow as if time itself had stretched thin. Keller pulled the bird around one final time, scanning in every direction, before finally banking north toward base, the aircraft, groaning beneath him, systems, unstable controls lagging, and still that static whisper echoing faintly in his ears as if the silence had memory. He climbed hard, pushing altitude as fast as he dared, needing to get out of the valley, to get clear of the place that felt like it remembered too much and wanted to keep him there just a little longer as the sunlight grew stronger with. Every foot he rose, the cockpit began to stabilize a little. The lights flickered back to normal, and the whispers faded, though not completely, and when he finally broke over the last ridge, the radio crackled back to life, but only barely. He checked. His coordinates expecting to be off by miles given the chaos, but his systems claimed he was exactly where he should be, and that made no sense at all. He ran a diagnostic partial results, incomplete like pieces of code had been rewritten in the background of the onboard systems, like something had reached in and moved things around and then stepped away, leaving only questions behind. Base was calling for a status update. His name repeated 3 times, and he answered flatly. Voice hoarse, telling them he was inbound damage severe and that he had encountered something unexplained, and then paused unsure of how to even begin to describe what he had seen. The controller asked again if he needed escort or emergency crews, and Keller said negative. Just prepare for a rough landing and keep the tower eyes open for anything out of place, anything unusual, because something had changed and he knew it. Whatever he had followed into the valley was not supposed to exist, and yet it did. And he had seen it, and now it had seen him. And something told him this was not over, that the real damage would not be to the aircraft, but to the questions he could never answer, and the ones he had not yet asked. He tried to hail the mystery jet on comms, but there was only static and faint interference, as if something was jamming the airwaves or distorting space around them. Something unseen that crawled through signal and light, the kind of noise that does not belong in man-made machines. Keller adjusted frequencies, flipped to the emergency band, then to encrypted ops, then finally to an open channel, still nothing. No call sign, no acknowledgement, no beacon, just that low mechanical hiss that rose and fell like breath behind a wall. And the sound, it was wrong, not digital, not natural, more like a voice buried too deep to surface, but too close to ignore. He watched in disbelief as the damaged aircraft continued its impossible glide, banking to the left, with a slowness that suggested control, but not pilot control. Something else, something guiding from within or beyond. And as it held altitude, defying physics with half a wing, Keller felt again that crushing sensation behind his eyes, like a weight pressing down a presence he could not see but felt circling his thoughts, pulling on his memory, like fingers sorting through a drawer. And the bird ahead of him did not stall, did not spiral. It just held steady, like it was daring him to keep up, daring him to come closer, and Keller was already doing so before he realized what choice he had made. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the valley, and for a moment both jets flew in near perfect formation, one alive, one not, one whole one broken, the symmetry unsettling. Like a mirror showing not reflection but memory, and Keller fought the urge to pull away because he was beginning to recognize details that made no sense. The tail structure, the soot pattern near the exhaust, the bent antenna on the spine, they were all familiar. Not just familiar, but identical to the damage his own aircraft had sustained in a training accident 3 years ago, the one that nearly grounded him permanently. But that aircraft had been scrapped, decommissioned, stripped of its shell, and recorded into logs as a complete loss. And yet here it was, or something like it ahead of him, flying without logic or flame, missing a pilot, and yet not crashing, as though gravity had lost interest in it, as though the rules had bent or broken, or simply been rewritten without telling anyone, and the air around them grew thinner. Despite the low altitude, a cold, whispering current brushing the canopy from the outside, as if something moved along the skin of the aircraft just out of sight, but never out of reach. Keller tightened his grip on the controls, every warning light now glowing steadily, as if they too had stopped trying to scream and had settled into quiet surrender. The damaged A-10 banked again, descending gently into a narrow, cut between 2 black ridges, their stone faces unnaturally smooth, like wind had never touched them, and Keller followed his mind, screaming against the decision, but his body acting on a different command, something older than training, older than language, the kind of instinct that moves a soldier before the bullet, the kind that does not ask why. He dropped into the cut and everything changed. The sky dimmed. The comms died again. The altimeter began spinning like a compass thrown into a magnet. Storm and the air pressure dropped. Keller adjusted his mask, but the oxygen feed stuttered for 3 full seconds before stabilizing, and when he looked down at the ground, something was moving between the rocks, something that left no shadow, but rearranged the dust as it passed shapes without form, motion without body, like echoes learning how to walk. The A-10 ahead climbed slightly and vanished behind a jagged outcrop, and Keller pulled up sharp, clearing the ridge just in time to see a flat expanse open up a barren field, surrounded by stone walls rising like fortress ruins, cracked and ancient. And there the ghost jet was lowering its landing gear and beginning to touch down on the unmarked surface. And Keller saw that there were other shapes out there in the dusk, shapes half buried in the dust. Some of them aircraft, some of them not. He circled above, trying to process what he was seeing. More broken airframes scattered across the plain, some intact, some partially absorbed into the stone like they had landed and never left, and were slowly becoming part of the land. Keller saw tail fins that did not belong to any known design. Cockpit glass melted in ways that suggested no fire, only time and pressure, and one frame that looked too much like a jet he had seen years ago. Listed missing over the Pacific, presumed lost to ocean, but here it was, with its canopy open and a helmet still resting on the seat. He descended slowly, cautiously, the controls stiff, now barely responsive. The aircraft shuddering with every motion, like it too wanted to stop, like it feared what was below, and the closer he got, the more the sensation built in his chest. That wrongness. That weight, that pressure, not physical but real, something watching from every direction, without form, without heat, without sound, just presence, and it thickened around the cockpit until the only sound Keller could hear was his own heartbeat and the low, steady whisper in the static, which now pulsed in perfect sync with the throb in his head. His landing gear extended, the struts creaked, and he touched down lightly on the hard ground, expecting to bounce or skid. But the aircraft settled like it had landed before, like the ground was familiar, like it had been waiting for him. And as the engines powered down on their own, Keller sat frozen eyes locked on the forward canopy, because standing ahead of him in the middle of the stone field was a man in a flight suit identical to his own arms at his sides, helmet in hand, face in shadow. Keller opened the canopy, climbed down slowly, boots hitting ground that felt too soft for stone and too hard for soil, and the man did not move, did not speak, did not breathe, just stood watching. And Keller took 1 step forward, 2, 3, and the man raised his head, and Keller saw his own face, younger, scarred from an injury. He had never received eyes colder than his own, and then the man turned and walked toward the ghost A-10, now parked silently among the other broken frames, and disappeared into the open cockpit as if he belonged there and had only stepped out to greet himself. Keller stood in the fading light, heart slamming against ribs, breath shallow, and saw now that every aircraft around him bore some part of himself. Markings from his own history, errors in paint pattern dents, in the same places he had once caused during rough landings. They were all his, all versions of machines. He had flown, or might have flown, or could fly one day, and the idea hit him like a blade that this place was not a graveyard, but a memory, not a field of wreckage, but a collection of echoes, each one tethered to a moment he had lived or avoided, or never reached. And in that moment the field shifted, not physically but perceptually, like the lens through which he viewed the world had twisted, and the ground beneath his boots trembled gently, as if sighing, and he knew that staying here was dangerous, not because of enemy fire or collapse or radiation, but because the longer he remained, the less sure he would be of which world he truly belonged to, and which version of himself he might become if he let go. He turned back to his own A-10, climbed inside the cockpit that no longer smelled like metal and fuel, but of something older, something dry and cold like paper sealed in a tomb, and he powered systems one by one, each screen flickering before stabilizing every gauge 1 degree. Off but working, and the static now gone, replaced with silence, absolute and perfect and terrifying. He throttled up the engines, shuddered into life, the ground loosened its grip, and the aircraft rolled forward toward a makeshift path between the ruins. And as he lifted off into the low light between 2 rising peaks, the valley behind him folded into shadow and disappeared, like a page turned too quickly to catch the words. And the only thing he took with him was the echo of his own eyes. Watching him from the stone returning to base was a blur, emergency landing gear down, smoke curling into the sky, and crew swarming the wreck as Keller climbed out, dazed and demanding answers. The tower claimed no other A-10s were in the area, and satellite logs showed no heat signatures besides his own. The flight data recorder confirmed both missile strikes, but no trace of another aircraft, no debris, no transponder ping, no eyewitness reports, nothing, and yet Keller had followed its scene. It touched the air. It passed through, felt the unnatural weight it left behind in every direction, and he knew it had been there even if no one else did. The ground crew pulled the A-10 into the hangar under tight protocol, the damage extensive, the underside shredded, the left stabilizer split, the fuselage peppered with burn marks and impact craters that looked too precise, too deliberate. Like the hits had not come from random fire but had been placed. Keller was ordered into debrief, and he walked the hallway like a man still somewhere else. His boots echoing off the concrete as voices called his name, but none of them sounded real. None of them reached him in the way they were supposed to, and the further he moved from the runway, the less certain he became that he had left the valley at all. Inside the intelligence room, he sat across from 3 officers, none of whom wore name tags, all of whom watched him like an animal that had crossed a fence they did not know existed. They asked questions about altitude weapons, visuals, radio contact. But Keller answered in fragments, not because he refused to share, but because the words would not come, not the real ones, not the ones that would explain what it felt like to see your own face watching you from the skin of something dead that refused to fall from the sky. He told them about the aircraft with half a wing, about the landing field filled with frames from other times, other lives, other choices, and about the whispering static that followed him into the valley and clung to his cockpit like frost. But the officers did not write anything down. They only nodded and leaned back, and at one point one of them asked if he remembered the date clearly. The question hitting, too hard, too fast, because Keller realized he did not. He had left on October 2nd and landed the same day, but the sun had not moved. Right, the clock on his dash had spun faster than real time, and the internal chronometer had lost nearly 4 minutes during flight. That was when the questioning stopped. The officers stood, thanked him for his service, and told him someone would speak with him again before week's end, and that he should remain on base and make no outbound calls until the review was complete. He was escorted to quarters, not his usual room, but an isolated dorm, down a silent hallway with a single flickering overhead light and no other doors marked. And when he asked if he was being confined, the escort simply said, "These are temporary conditions until we complete internal checks inside the room." There was no window, only a bed and a desk, and a small screen that showed base weather in a loop. Keller sat on the edge of the bed, still in flight gear, his gloves. In his lap, his fingers numb. He removed his boots slowly, not because he was tired, but because he wanted to make sure his hands still moved the way they were supposed to. He wanted to be certain he had come back whole. That night he dreamed of the Stone Valley again, of the broken aircraft, lined in ritual rows of the figure standing among the wreckage in the same flight suit, and of a sound he could not name. Not a voice, not an engine. Something between metal and breath, a sound that rapped A round thought, and made memory feel like an intruder, and when he woke he found his flight recorder had been removed from his locker without notice, and that his gear had been cleaned perfectly too perfectly, even the sand between his boots gone, as if he had never flown. The next day, he walked the base trying to speak with anyone who might have been on radar watch during his flight. But the shifts had been reassigned, and no one on duty claimed to have seen anything abnormal. Some nodded. With understanding, some looked away, and one officer from the signal tower stopped him in the hallway and whispered that for 7 minutes the radar went blank, that his blip vanished completely, and that protocol told them to keep silent until... The command reviewed the anomaly. Keller asked for a report, but the man only shook his head and said nothing. Ever gets written down when time goes missing. He went to maintenance hoping to inspect his bird, but the hangar was sealed locked behind. Military police, and marked with a sign that read, "Restricted entry authorized personnel only." And when he asked who authorized the restriction, the answer came back with no name, only a division code he had never seen before. He returned to his quarters that night to find the door ajar, and inside nothing was taken, but everything had been touched. The desk chair was angled slightly. The bed was remade with too much precision, and his flight gloves were now sitting on the pillow, fingers folded as if waiting. The base commander called for him the following morning, not to a meeting room, but to the far edge of the compound, where a temporary structure had been erected. Gray walls, no windows, and a single entry door guarded by 2 soldiers. Keller was led inside past rows of black cases stacked along the wall and into a room that held only one thing, a large display screen, and on that screen a still image from his camera footage, frozen at the exact frame he had hoped would never be seen by anyone else. It showed the ghost A-10 flying through the canyon perfectly visible, despite his earlier belief that the footage had glitched, and below it, half shrouded in shadow, the rows of broken aircraft parked across stone. The image was grainy, but clear enough, and someone had circled one frame in red and labeled it with a date and a call sign. And that call sign was his own, from a mission listed as aborted 5 years ago due to engine failure, a mission he barely remembered but apparently had been logged under emergency return protocol, with zero confirmation that the aircraft had made it back. A voice behind him said quietly, "Do you believe in temporal displacement?" And Keller turned to find the same officer from his first debrief, but now without a notepad, without any pretense of rank or formality, and the man repeated the question slower this time and added that there have been other sightings, other pilots, other jets found or seen in places they should not be sometimes. Years before the missions they flew, sometimes years after, and that most of them do not return, and those who do are never quite the same.